Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a great holiday. Having a great holiday. This is Fine Music, episode 156. Today, we're going to have Murray start off, as Fred's experiencing some technical difficulties. So go ahead, Murray.
Okay, I am going to follow up on Jim's episode last week about King Crimson, and just provide some more information that I know. And I'm actually going to focus on two albums. We have The Great Deceiver and Absent Lovers. Both of these are live albums, which, especially earlier in their career, King Crimson did not do a lot of. But well, I guess what I'd start out is in my mind, there are like three phases of King Crimson. There's the classic King Crimson of the early 70s that was, inventing prog rock and really wildly experimental. And that version, pretty much every album had a somewhat different lineup of musicians. He kept changing musicians. I mean, if you don't know, Robert Fripp is the man behind King Crimson. He's the lead guitarist, writes most of the music, and just is the director, the man who makes it happen. So throughout the early 70s, they put out a number of albums. So like I said, they kept changing personnel. And then in 74, they broke up. And then in 1981, he came back with version 2 of King Crimson, which I refer to as the new wave King Crimson, because they took a lot of influence from what was going on in punk and new wave. And then I'll actually skip ahead because they lasted for about 4 years. They put out 3 albums. What's unique about that phase is it was the same lineup of 4 musicians for all 4 albums. I mean, all 3 albums. Being Robert Fripp, Adrian Belew, Tony Levin, and Bill Bruford. And then they broke up. And then during the mid-90s through the 2000s, there were a number of different versions of King Crimson. But what seemed unique was that Fripp was experimenting with multiple people playing the same instrument. The first revision was what he called the double trio, where he had 2 drummers, 2 bass players, and 2 guitarists. And then he went through versions where he had just drums and guitar, but 2 of each. And the final version, which I was lucky enough to see a couple of years ago, is the one that had 3 drummers right in front, like really directing things. And then him and another guitarist and bass player and keyboards and saxophones, and just a wild collection of musicians up front. But I don't like that later King Crimson. Other than seeing them, I'm not deeply familiar with their work. I haven't really explored it. So we can go back a stage to the 80s King Crimson, which I got into a lot. Now, in the late 70s, Fripp was doing some really interesting things. That was the point when he was working with what he called Frippertronics, which is something that is in a slightly different form, is extremely popular today among all sorts of musicians, and they call it sampling. And it's where you get a sampler and you play a phrase into the sampler and play it back and play something else on top of it and play those 2 back. Well, Fripp was doing this with tape decks, where he was literally playing, got a tape deck going and recording what he was playing, and then recording over that, and then recording over that, all live. So, as well as in the studio, but that was pretty unique. But he was also working with a bunch of musicians. He, of course, very famously worked with Bowie on both the Heroes album and the Scary Monsters album, and very aggressive hard rock guitar on those. But he also worked with Peter Gabriel. I think we're all familiar with that, with the first couple of Peter Gabriel solo albums. And then, somewhat surprisingly, he did a solo album with Daryl Hall of Hall & Oates, which he considered that, and I think it was Gabriel's second album and his solo album Exposure, as actually being a trilogy of albums that all went together and there were certain songs that repeated in different form from one album to another. And then he put together a band called the League of Gentlemen, which was a new wave dance band. I did see them play at a local club, and I found it really funny because if you know anything about Crimson and Fripp, he always performs sitting down. And so here he is sitting down on stage, chiding the audience for not dancing. They're like, "We are a dance band. Why aren't you dancing?" It's like, "Why aren't you?" But anyway, then he formed the latest King Crimson, which, like I said, did him after all these kind of new wave experiments. Adrian Belew, who, if you're not familiar, went from playing with Zappa to playing with Bowie to playing with the Talking Heads to playing with Crimson. Bruford, of course, was one of the original members. I mean, not the original Crimson, but from back in the 70s. And then, and Tony Levin is just an amazing bass player, if you're not familiar with him. And at that point, he had worked with Gabriel, of course, but he also worked with Paul Simon on the One Trick Pony album. And he also played on John Lennon's Double Fantasy. So, I mean, I was, when I saw that lineup, I'm like, okay, I have to go see these guys. And I hitchhiked to Seattle to see them play. It was an amazing concert. And that's this album, Absent Lovers. This is actually recorded at the end of their touring period, where I caught them at the very beginning of their touring for their first album, Discipline, which, Jim, I believe you mentioned last week.
Yeah, I love that album.
It's so incredible. Yeah. And then
Elephant Talk.
I'm so jealous that you've seen them live. To watch the live videos, you get those three drummers out there, and they're so wild yet so precise.
Yeah. Well, that's and that's one of the things of every version of Crimson. They did this version put out, I say, 3 albums: Discipline, which is red, one called Beat, which is blue, and one called Three of a Perfect Pair, which is yellow. And then, like I say, this album is from their tour after the last album. And one of the things about this version of Crimson is they actually did not do much improvisation on stage. That most of the songs on this, well, they're, a little looser and maybe a little more expanded, but they follow the studio versions pretty closely. One exception is, and I find this very interesting. Okay, on Discipline, there's the song Thelahan Jinchi, which again, Jim, you mentioned. The version of the album is only half the story. The version in the concert that I saw him, because, it ends with he's being hassled by these thugs on the street. And then he goes around the corner and they're 2 policemen. And that's how he ends the story on the studio version. Well, the version I saw, then the police hassle him. And it's actually much more entertaining story that he gets hassled by the thugs and then he gets hassled by the police. But so anyway, I'd recommend, if you like that period of Crimson, this is a great live album. It's it expands a little bit on a number of the songs. The Great Deceiver goes back to the early 70s. This was recorded around the time of, I don't know how familiar with the albums you are, but Lark's Tongue's an Aspect and Starless in Bible Black. And in fact, what's interesting is if you listen to this and you listen to Starless and Bible Black, why there are certain tracks that sound like they're the same, because they are. That their record company, they wanted to release a live album because they felt at that point, that's when they were at their peak, is doing live improvisation stuff. And their record company wouldn't let them. This is all from Bill Bruford's autobiography. The record company said no to the live album. So what did they do? They recorded their concerts, they cut out the audience noise, and they released it as a, quote, studio album. So there's some of my feelings and insight on Crimson.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
It's a great band.
Yeah.
And Fred, but one of the albums that you didn't mention was No Pussyfooting with Brian Eno.
Oh, yes.
And that's when I first heard, Fripp and Eno, right around that time. I was working at the Cal Poly radio station, and there's some ambient music on there.
Yeah,
Sort of. It's not,
sort of.
I don't know if you could call it ambient music, but it's experimental.
Yeah,
And you're right, they were experimenting with tape loops and stuff.
yeah.
And that was really interesting stuff. And
Actually,
then
on
we also
this
talked about the
album,
time when Brian Eno was using this the set of cards called oblique
yeah.
strategies. Do you remember that?
Oh yeah, yeah. That's what
Yeah.
he did with when he recorded Low with Bowie. They used that
Really?
a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, that
Pretty interesting way to generate ideas.
yeah, yes, indeed. Actually, on this album, the music that they play as the band is coming on stage is from No Pussyfooting.
Oh, cool.
So
Yeah, and he's as a band leader, I can't imagine what their practices would be like. Can you imagine? Oh my
yeah, I um I don't know, because you're right. His music has always been so precise and so
and
exact
complicated. Yeah.
and very complicated.
Yeah.
And yet he also, liked to leave room for his band members to improvise there. So it must have been really tricky. I have to imagine that he's probably as much of a taskmaster as Zappa was.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. Are they still playing live shows?
No, what I've heard, I mean, you never know. He's broken up the band a number
Yeah.
of times, but that this last tour in 2020 is it, that he's
Yeah.
retiring the band completely. But like I say, he's done that before, so who knows?
Which brings us to Tanya.
Yeah,
Yeah,
You care to
Tanya.
comment, Jim?
She's trip, man. That Sunday afternoon lunch with Fripp and Tanya is hilarious. It's really good. And
Yeah.
you can tell that guy can play anything he wants on a guitar. I mean,
Yeah.
there's probably nothing beyond his ability to play. I mean,
I think so. Yeah.
and I can't imagine the amount of practice that takes is just mind-boggling to me.
Maybe they should go out on tour. Wouldn't that be
That
fun?
would be a trip. Yeah, that would be funny. Reunite the Plasmatics with her as the lead.
Yeah.
And so there you have it. King Crimson Part 2.
Part 2. Yep.
That was episode 156. Thank you, Murray. So glad you did this.
Oh, thank you.